back with a little thing I told you about campaign finance, and you'll remember that our essential question is campaign finance reform possible and desirable? So far, I've been playing under the assumption that it is desirable, which it is possible not everyone agrees with, and I think there are reasonable arguments against that. But most of the evidence I have presented so far is of people really manipulating the system by using their access. So back in the 1970s, when there was a Watergate scandal, which you probably mostly know as abuse of presidential power, it was also an abuse of campaign finance power. And Congress introduced the first law dealing with all these things called the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Reform Act. And it did a whole bunch of things which are listed here. And I'm going to feel free to go quickly through this because one, you could have read about it, and two, you can pause this video and catch up as needed. The first thing it created the Federal Election Commission, which is an office of the government which is responsible for making sure that their financing is done fairly. It created these public financing for presidential elections. And this is something that used to be more important up until about 2000 or 2004. And in these elections, what would happen is they would tell the major parties, if you promise to limit your overall spending to X, which was some amount adjusted for inflation every year, the federal government will give you a grant of Y, which was perhaps half of all the money that you needed to spend that year. And up until 2004 or so, that was worth it. It was so much money that people would limit their spending and therefore accept the federal funds. In 2004, maybe it was 2008, I can't remember if Obama was first or Bush, they just started blowing the lids off those financing limits, and they spend so much more than now that the federal money doesn't even mean anything. But at the time, it really did mean something. It placed a cap on a contribution. It said no individual citizen can spend more than $1,000 per year, or $1,000 on a candidate in any election cycle. So obviously, I don't know if you've been able to figure this out, but this is a problem between freedom and equality. Should I be free to spend my money on the politicians I want and get them elected? Or no, that's not fair because, you can give $2,000 to get somebody elected. I can't give anything. Why should you have more power than I should? So the limit was set at $1,000. Now, this is also back in 1974. So $1,000 is not that much of a limit. On the other hand, if a politician's campaign back in the day, let's say it still costs $300,000 or $400,000, if I've only given 1/400th of that, I can only have so much power over the candidate. So that's the argument. And by the way, you could give not only $1,000 a year, but you could only do it, or per cycle, but you could only give that $25,000 every year. So there were limits. They also created political action committees, which was if an interest group or a arm of a interest group wants to give money, they can't give it. They have to form an organization called a political action committee. They have to register with the Federal Election Commission, and they may only give $5,000 per candidate. One of the biggest things that it seems that conservatives and liberals almost all agree on is this: disclosure. They have said you have to tell the American public where you're getting your money from so they can make a reasonable choice about which candidates they're electing and if they like who they're taking money from. And last but not least, they set spending limits. This was in a slightly different year in 1971, and these limits applied to congressional candidates and to all sorts of other candidates. You could only spend so much on a campaign to keep it from getting out of control. So the reason this is all in a red box is this was meant to be a wall that was blocking money from getting through. But as I told you, money like water will find an outlet. And as it turns out, within about 30 years, or I guess it's maybe 25 years, these limits were there, but they were all but shattered because people had found ways around them. So how did this happen? The first one actually got shattered very quickly, and that is this Buckley v. Valeo. And in this particular case, what the court ruled was you cannot stop a person from spending his or her own money on the campaign, because the court said the only legitimate reason to have a limit on expenditures is that you're being bribed. And if it's my money, I can't bribe myself. So it's my money. It's a First Amendment case. I can spend it. And once the court said that, Congress did not want to limit the only rich people to voting, so they took away the limits altogether so that people could spend money. So that one was knocked down right away. Then the other ones that got knocked down were this. The first thing was something called soft money. And soft money was, okay, Ava is running for Congress, and I've maxed out my donations to Ava. But then I give a $50,000 donation to the political party that Ava is associated with. Now, the party can't literally turn around and give that to Ava, but they can do party building activities, getting more people registered to vote in her district, sending out general information flyers in her district. In other words, it allows me to have a lot more influence through this soft money, and those donations were unlimited. Then the last two, which sort of go together, are issue ads and independent expenditures. And these two things are best exemplified by this little ad that I'm about to play for you, which I hope you can hear. Oh, look at that. We're not going to hear it because it's not there. Okay, so I'm just going to recreate it for you. Basically, what it says is, this is literally so ridiculous that you're not even going to believe it. But back in the time, right after 9/11, there was this big to-do that people on certain news media sites started saying they want to build a mosque on the 9/11 site. Now, what this mosque really was about 4 blocks away from where the World Trade Center said there was an Islamic Cultural Center being built, and in the Islamic Cultural Center was a room that was a prayer room. But this somehow turned into a mosque that was being built on the 9/11 site. So somebody started running advertisements on television, and they said, the guy's name was Bruce Braley. I'll never forget it. Maybe I'll find the video for you on Friday. Some people want to build a mosque on the 9/11 site, and amazingly, Bruce Braley supports this. Call Bruce Braley and tell him what you think. Right? So clearly, it sounds like an attack ad against Bruce Braley. Well, here's the thing: it didn't say vote against him, nor did it say vote for his opponent. And as the Supreme Court has ruled, as long as it doesn't say one of those two things, vote for or vote against, it's not campaign money. It's an independent expenditure. We just happen to be expressing our opinion on a topic. And it just happens to be, we'd like you to know where Bruce Borelli stands on that topic. But no, not us. We didn't say anything at all about voting. So you could just flood the airwaves with these ads, and it would just overwhelm any messages that were out there. Basically, it was unlimited spending. Just like when you're paying somebody, you can't pay him in, like, if you pay him in dollars, he has to pay tax on that. If you pay him in cars, he has to pay tax on the values of the car. So, right, money is fungible. Originally, the limits were conceived that you can't give him money, nor can you run ads for him on TV, because that's basically giving him money. And what the court ruled again is, just so long as you don't say vote for or vote against, you haven't given anything to him. And actually, if you do this, if you search, although maybe they've taken it down for Ted Cruz and other politicians, they'll have all this bizarre footage of themselves out there on YouTube, like walking and looking thoughtfully, smiling with their families. And the reason is, if that information is publicly available, then the people who wanted to run issue ads could grab that footage and make a commercial on his behalf. And they could say, the campaign could say, we didn't have anything to do with it at all. They just independently did that on their own. So it became a total farce. All right. So as I mentioned, here's another wall they put up, and this is BICRA, the one that was mentioned in the opening quote, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Sometimes you'll also hear it as the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform. John McCain was the lead Republican sponsor. Russ Feingold was the lead Democratic sponsor. And this attempted to take on these things. So here's the first thing it did. It banned soft money to national parties. Now, you could still give to state parties, and I think that's down there later on, but it was a maximum of $10,000. So again, it's a lot of money. People can give a lot. It's not that much of a limitation on your freedom, but you can't buy a party for $10,000. It also increases the individual contributions. So you may say, wait a minute, I thought this was a limitation. The argument or the agreement to the other side is, we don't mind people getting involved and putting their money where their mouth is to support a candidate. We just want to make sure that we know who they are. And in 1974, $1,000 was a lot more today, so we're going to double that. And it's not $25,000 a year anymore. It's $95,000 every 2-year cycle. It also limited the timing of issue ads, and they said, here's the deal. You can run an issue ad, you can tell people what you think about something, but if you're going to do it, it has to be either 30 days before a primary or 60 days before the general election. And the reasoning is so that in the last closing days of the election, that's why you hear those advertisements that say, I'm Al Gore, or I'm Al Gore, and how old am I? I'm Joe Biden and I support this message. I'm Donald Trump and I support this message. That's how you know it's the candidate speaking directly. And they wanted to clear the air of all the clutter of all these crazy groups, America for this and that, who you don't really know who they are, and open it up for the candidates alone. So where I said it took about 20 or 30 years for these to fall apart, these fell apart almost immediately. And here are some of the things that happened. Whoops, I got too much in the way. You get a bunch of court challenges. The first one is the Wisconsin Right to Life case, which challenges the issue ad timing. And Right to Life is, as you know, an anti-abortion group, and their argument went something like this to the Supreme Court. There was a senator running for re-election in Wisconsin, and they wanted to run ads telling everybody that his position was pro-abortion and they should vote against him. They argued to the court, we only get to vote for our senators once every 6 years. When is exactly the time that our group wants to talk to the public and tell them about their senator? And the answer is the 60 days before the election. And when is exactly the time you've told us we can't speak? 60 days before the election. This is a clear violation of our free speech. The response from the other side was, it's not a violation of your free speech. The candidate can tell people he's against abortion or for against abortion or where his opponent stands as many times as he wants to. He can yell it, he can scream it, he can run 10 million television advertisements. But this is a time for information to come from the candidates because the democracy can't function when we have everybody screaming different things and nobody knows where the information is coming from. As it turns out, the Supreme Court ruled with Wisconsin Right to Life, and this limitation on issue ads has since been banned. Then after that, you have another Supreme Court case called Citizens United, and Citizens United challenges limits on spending by corporations or unions as a limitation on their free speech. And in essence, the Supreme Court does in fact rule that the Supreme Court the Supreme Court, any corporation or any union that wants to, can in fact spend as much money as it wants on an election. They have free speech rights just like anybody else. So what happens after that is you have the rise of these things called 527s, which another name you'll see for these some places is super PACs. Like the old Political Action Committee, but these are a super PAC. And by the way, if you're wondering why they have all these crazy numbers and names, maybe you've heard of a 401k retirement plan or a 403b. They're looking at the section of the tax code where these organizations are described. So the reason it's called a 401k retirement plan is if you go through all the tax law and you get to the place where it describes the plan that people are saving for their retirements, it's section 401k. That's why they call it that. So this is section 527 that people discovered. If I organized my group under 527, it could do things just like a PAC, but it could take unlimited donations. So people started opening these super PACs, and like Sheldon Adelson had given $25 million in a single bunch to Newt Gingrich when he was running for president, and his wife gave $25 million also. So that's one couple was able to give $50 million. But then things got really ugly. Like Sheldon Adelson does not mind his name being associated with this. But if you're Home Depot or you're Lowe's or your giant food stores or your Walmart, you may not want to anger people by giving money to a political party. And that's where it got really clever. And you have the rise of these things called 501c4s, or sometimes they're just referred to as C4s. And these are basically super PACs that do not have to disclose their donors. So the entire campaign finance system is broken. And after this video, I'm going to list for you or give you the link to another video about those 501c4s by Stephen Colbert that basically shows how the entirety of the campaign finance system was broken by these things. All right, that's it.